What's up everybody, I'm Derek, this is Rocking E Forge, and today is the third and final part of the Gate Latch project for the California Blacksmithing Association and Artist Blacksmithing Association of North America's Level 1 certification. This part will focus most heavily on the latch portion itself, which includes a forge weld and then getting all of this to proper dimensions, and then I'll show drilling holes for the mounting plate toward the end of the video. I hope you've been following along and been enjoying this series and that it helps you in your level 1 journey. So let's get out to the shop and let's get rocking. And the first order of business is forge welding that hook. Present me here. During the editing process, it became apparent that past me didn't ever come back to finish that thought or explain this forge welding process, so I'm gonna have to do some talking and voiceover to explain what's going on in this video. Now it turns out you need extra mass at the end of this round bar in order to get this harpoon shape at the tip of the gate hook, and while there could be many different ways to accomplish this, the project requires you to do a forge weld in order to get that extra mass. Now in this video I'm using 3/8 inch round stock, primarily because it fits the dimensions of the thickness of all of the pieces on the assignment sheet. However, it does also lend itself better to forge welding than stock of smaller cross section, because smaller stock tends to not hold heat as well and it makes it a lot more difficult to forge weld as a result. So 3/8 inch round stock is a good stock size to do for this project, which is probably why it actually appears on the assignment sheet that way, because it holds heat long enough to actually get a successful forge weld most of the time with it. Now the process I follow in this video is to nick into the steel with that butchering tool about a 1/2 inch from the tip of the round stock. The butcher makes that nick perpendicular at what will become the tip of that gate hook and angled away from the cut, which you will see helps facilitate the taper seen at the end of that harpoon shape. Now, don't cut it off, as the next step will be to bend that nicked tip over to the point that it lays flat against the parent stock material in order to forge weld that seam together. Now it helps to forge that region of the tip and the little nicked off section square, or at least to a rough square, prior to making the forge weld in order to maximize the surface area at the weld location. It would have been great for me to do that prior to actually nicking in with the butchering tool, but as you'll see, you can do it the way that I do it and still be successful. Now in order to complete that weld, you have to get the piece of steel up to about 2200 degrees Fahrenheit, which corresponds to a bright kind of a lemon yellow color. Now, this generally requires you to crank the propane on your propane forge much higher than you usually do, or have a very particular fire in a coal forge, which I don't have a lot of expertise in personally, having never forge welded in a coal forge, so you can find some great videos elsewhere on YouTube. Black Bear Forge does some great discussions on forge welding in a coal forge, especially in order to get the right reducing fire for a forge weld. This style of forge weld is a great way to learn the process as you're not working with many moving parts. Another way to tell when the steel is reaching the appropriate temperature is the flux and the surface of the steel will begin to look like it's starting to flow like molten glass or melt, or some people discuss kind of an iridescence or a shimmering of the surface of the steel in the fire itself. Now it's worth noting here that this is almost the point where steel burns. Yes, you heard that right, burns. And if you pull the steel from the fire and it looks like a sparkler during the 4th of July, you've gotten the steel too hot, that steel is probably burnt and it will probably crumble or fall off when you hit it with your hammer. Now a bit of smokes and just a few sparks coming off the steel is okay. It generally means you still got it a little too hot, and you'll see that my first welding heat there was a bit of smoke coming off, no sparks. In my experience, that's about the point that is kind of right at the top of where you want it to be. Just try to avoid too many sparks because that's indicative of you burning the steel. Now it's not expressly necessary, but I tend to like to use a little bit of anhydrous borax flux to keep out oxygen prior to fully closing up that seam in order to keep as much of that surface clean for the weld as possible. An abundance of forge scale in that seam, which is generated by high temperature oxidation of the steel, can prevent the two faces from welding together, and it might force you to restart. Which is the reason that I started with the end of the piece as opposed to making the entire shape. If the forge weld ends up failing or you end up burning that piece off, all you gotta do is cut off the tip, restart, and you haven't, taken the time to put in all of the rest of the shape. Now that first welding heat should be used simply to set the weld with a few light taps, then you can reflux the seams and put it back in the fire. You do not need heavy hammer strikes here. In fact, you are more likely to separate that weld if you hit it too hard before that weld is actually set. Then put it back in the forge and take it back up to that same welding heat, and when you bring it back to the anvil, ramp up the force of your blows, starting with light taps and then moving to actually forming the steel into the shape that you want it to, once it feels like it becomes a solid piece. Now once that forge weld is set, you can work on tapering the tip into that final harpoon shape per the assignment sheet and move on to actually shaping the full gate hook. Back here didn't weld, but it's gonna be a gate hook, so I'm not that concerned with that. So I'm gonna start forming this hook according to the drawing. This is probably what I should have done with the last section, trying to bend it. Doing all right. Now, I'm gonna do this. We're getting there. This curve ended up a little too far out. I want it back here a little better. This is gonna get shortened, but I'm gonna do that on a grinder or a file or something. But I need to pull this curve back and straighten this out. What am I doing? I forgot what I was doing for a second. That. Okay. Let's tighten this up. That looks flawless. Okay, so I'm going to stick with that. Now I need to measure up where the actual circular connector starts, and then bend that. Perfect. I just need 3 inches along the shaft. All right, so we're gonna go out here. I'm gonna measure 3 inches from that bend. Just gonna bend that around. Okay, I'm gonna cut that off, because that looks like enough space. Might have to do some extra cutting, but so we want 3 inches between this curve and the start to the next one. So that actually looks a little long. I'm gonna take this to the horn and work this over the horn a little bit. I wanna hold here, but that's hot. All right, we're gonna go back to the same thing we were. All right, so I'm gonna cut this off here, and I'm gonna fiddle around with it to get the right length here. All right, so here's what I was trying to do. This way. Pretty spot on. which means this pigtail is far too long. Which means I need to unbend it. Probably shorten it. Let's see. All right, I can't tell you how or why, but I can just tell about where I need to cut. Almost spot on. I'm gonna go ahead and tighten that up on the anvil. I want that circular instead of oblong. And so I unbent it a tad. Oh, I think that's too skinny. Supposed to be 7/8 inch inside diameter. It's just outside. Okay, use the bending forks off camera. That's pretty darn close. It's like a 1/16 less than 7/8. It's not a perfect circle, but I'm gonna call that a win. I'm gonna straighten this shank out. This thing's got a little wonky. And there you have it. That looks phenomenal. Might be a little long, but I think, assuming there's some tolerance, I think we'll be all right. I don't even think it's a little long. I think it's almost perfect. Give this a nice brushing because it is a tad crusty. I'm going to do a little grinding to make the hook a little nicer. It fits nearly every dimension perfectly. Almost. Like, it is so close to being spot on. This makes me so happy. All right. So I'm going to take this piece of 1/8 inch plate, cut it at these dimensions tomorrow, sign off for the night, and crack on tomorrow morning. Now that's going to do it for today's project. If you enjoyed this project, please drop a like, leave a comment, hit subscribe, ring that notification bell. If you want to support me in the channel further, please consider becoming an honorary striker on my Patreon. That link is in the description below the video. And as always, keep on rocking.